are different pieces.
Okay. Come in, okay. All right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining me this morning. I'm excited to share my findings with you guys and hope you can all approach this presentation with an open mind and heart and be open to thinking about change and to hopefully taking this class in the way that it was intended. And first of all, I wanted to give a big thank you before I got started, not only to you guys for coming this morning, but especially to my participants. 20 very brave men and women responded to this study and poured out their hearts and souls and rehashed a very difficult time in their life and a very difficult decision they all made, all with the clear understanding that this data would be collected to hopefully help you. I didn't even ask anybody to be kind or civil and loving, but they all were anyway, so thank you again to all of them. Okay, so the second most important thing after the thank yous was to get to the ground rules for this morning. First rule is please hold all questions for this morning. Those of you in the room can write down your questions and talk to me afterwards, and if anybody is watching this on recording at a later time, then you can feel free to text, email, or call me. You can find my information in the book, or those of you in the room can just talk to me later. Next, no Bibles required this morning. My intent with this study from the very beginning was for it to be as clinical as possible. When I first described this study to some people, they said, oh, great, maybe you can take all the things that these people said to you and then find the Bible verse that says that they're wrong. And I said, no, that is not at all what I want to do. Doing anything like that, I think, would betray the trust that these people put in me. I'm not going to do that at all. Next thing is, take a deep breath. This is going to apply to me as well right now, but I say this here for a couple of reasons. First, I understand that the subjects and topics discussed this morning might be a little uncomfortable to hear, and I do not wish to upset anybody. And second, I understand that the people involved in this study might also be difficult for some of you to hear about. It was very important to me from the beginning to use the names of real people in this study, as I felt it would really help humanize the study a lot more for the words to be coming from people that many of you know. However, this is a very emotionally charged topic. It's possible that it might upset some of you to hear certain people's names being used. The possibility of somebody in this study being a member of your family, the possibility of them being a close personal friend is pretty high. Many of you will know many of the people from this study, and many of you in this room will know every person in this study. So I'd like to apologize up front, but I did not want to sacrifice the integrity of the study and all this hard work by taking out everyone's names just for the sake of a few people who might be upset by it. Most of these people have left the community for about 10 plus years, so I don't think their involvement is going to come as a shock to anybody. And also remember that they wanted to be named in this study. So it was important to me to honor that request. So here's a brief outline of what we're going to cover this morning. First, a brief intro about myself and how I decided to put this all together. Next, we'll get into the study itself. I'm going to try to limit my observations during that time to my objective observations, just letting their words and the data speak for itself. And finally, a few of my own personal takeaways, which I'll share my own personal subjective observations and aided by the words and feelings of those that I spoke to. Okay, so getting right into it with part one, including a bit about me and also a question I kept asking myself, why did I do this? So by way of introduction, I know everybody in this room knows who I am, but if anybody is streaming this or watching it later, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Brother Luke Gelineau from the Simi Hills Ecclesia. I've been a member of this ecclesial community my whole life. Both my parents were born Christadelphian, and so was I. I chose to be baptized about 20 years ago, a little less than that. I'm an insurance salesman by trade, which is something that most of you in this room probably know, but what many of you do not know is I went to school to do stuff like this. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in family consumer science with an option in consumer affairs and a minor in marketing. If you don't know what any of that means, don't worry, I don't really know either. But the important part is that I took full courses on how to facilitate and distribute proper scientific studies and surveys, and I learned how to conduct proper interviews. I use a bit of those skills in my day-to-day job now, but this is truly the first time I've really used my degree in the last 14 years. So Mom and Dad, thank you, it's finally paying off. And then the next question was, why do this study? And, I know how to do it, but the question I kept asking myself was, why do this at all? So here's the main reasons I could come up with. Number one, and most importantly, the main one is for the hopeful edification and education of fellow brothers and sisters in the Christadelphian community. I know that my professors would probably yell at me about this because we're supposed to remain unbiased when we conduct surveys and interviews. So doing a survey with the intent of trying to help or benefit the group that is involved in the survey is definitely a bit of a conflict of interest. I probably shouldn't be doing this study at all as somebody in that group. But there wasn't any way around that. I wasn't willing to drop out of Christadelphia just to conduct this survey with no conflicts, and I was bad in school anyway, so I'm okay breaking a few rules. I don't think my professors would be surprised. Personal curiosity. I've always been curious, as I'm sure many of you are, wondering, hey, I wonder what happened to so-and-so. But usually that's where my thought process would end about them. I just wouldn't think about them too much, and I would just think, I wonder what happened, and that would be that. Also, a bit of my own professional curiosity could kind of seep in there. I started to approach this as a salesman, and I thought, hey, if a bunch of my clients all started to leave me, shouldn't I start contacting them and try to figure out why they all left? And if they're all giving me very similar answers to each other, maybe there's something I can learn from that. I think that's possible for somebody in a professional capacity like mine, as a salesman, to just kind of cross their arms and be stubborn when somebody leaves them or goes elsewhere for their insurance. And you could say, well, I did everything by the book. I did everything legally and correct. So if they're choosing to leave, then there's nothing I can do about that. I should do nothing differently. And that's certainly an attitude that one can have, but if you could change something about the way that you conduct yourself and your business to make more people feel comfortable and included, and not sacrifice any of your principles or change the way you conduct your business on a legalistic or correct standpoint, then wouldn't you try to do that? That's how I felt. And finally, this all also came down to good timing. I did all of this after COVID hit, and everybody was was stuck at home and much more comfortable using Zoom and talking to people. And COVID gave me a pretty kind of a fatalistic outlook on this stuff. Where I was kind of saying, I might not see these people ever again. So whatever, any feelings of being uncomfortable broaching this topic kind of went out the window. And so I finally decided in my head to get this project done. I've been on the back burner in my brain for the last 12, 13 years. And I had to figure out how I was going to find my respondents. I knew right away that I had to limit this study to people who would fit certain criteria. Here's what I came up with, and I wanted them to fit all 4 of these criteria. 1, they must have stopped regularly attending a memorial service before the COVID-19 lockdown. I wanted to make sure their decision had already happened long enough ago for them to have formulated a concrete enough feeling about it. Last thing I wanted to do was contact somebody who just stopped coming recently and say, hey, do you want to be in a survey about being a former Christadelphian? I didn't want to, make that awkward, so I told myself I'd restrict this to people who seem to have more solidly made that decision. Second, I want them to live or have lived in the Southern California area. This is mostly just for ease of me contacting them, but also I think they would be more comfortable talking to me, and I'd be more comfortable talking to them if they knew who I was and were familiar with me. The participant had to be under the age 50. This was important to me because I wanted their departure to be relatively recent, as I felt that it would give us more actionable data. I could have tracked somebody down who left 50 years ago, and they would have said, oh, I left because we thought the commies were invading or whatever, and then that wouldn't help me now, so I wanted to have pretty firm, recent reasons I think we could actually do something about. Most importantly, they had to have been baptized. At first I was wondering if I could possibly include people who went to Sunday school their whole lives. They went to CYC for a while and they didn't actually get baptized. But I felt it'd be more interesting to talk to people who at one point were evidently so invested and had really bought into the community, because that means that it was theoretically a further journey for them to take to leave. And so these were all of their requirements, but I also had a few requirements I had to set for myself before I started to contact them. So my personal rules is, one of the most common things we are told in college, as I've already said, was to try to remain unbiased. I'm already not supposed to be the guy conducting this study at all, so I had to make extra certain that I was as unbiased as possible in my questioning. One thing I really had to work out of my system was to stop using the term "the truth" when referring to Christadelphian beliefs. It's obviously a pretty darn biased term that we all use amongst each other, and it's fine because we all share that same belief, but I could very well not contact somebody and say, so tell me, when did you stop believing in the truth? So I'll try not to use that term in the rest of this talk. If I accidentally slip and let it out, I hope you'll forgive me. We're all biased here and all have the same feelings, but I tried to get that out of my lexicon for this study. 2, don't question their truth. Speaking of the truth, it was important for me to try to remember to question what they're telling me. lots of times I'd find myself going into an interview thinking, oh yeah, this guy. I remember when they left, and this is the reason that they left. I kind of had my own reasons already in my head, and I also had to refrain myself from trying to steer them or coerce them into answering how I thought they should be answering. I talked to a few people about this study who had brought up the fact that these respondents themselves might be unreliable narrators of their own life events. They might say something happened with another brother or sister that upset them, and if I were a journalist, I could reach out to them and get their side of the story. But the purposes of this study is I'm just going to take everything that they told me at face value. The idea of going into a conversation already doubting things they're going to say and bringing your own conclusions seemed incredibly unhelpful. So if you hear anything in this study that somebody says and you say, hey, that's different from what they told me 10 years ago when I asked them, you are free to contact them yourself. Most of them were very open. I think would be very open to talking to you as well as myself. Number 3, don't try to preach. It was important to remember this was not to be treated as an opportunity to try to convince them that they were wrong or they made a bad decision or whatever. It was simply an opportunity to gather data that I could use. But it was hard at times to hear some of the things that they were saying and not to try to at least offer a different perspective or play devil's advocate, because that feeling is so baked into who I am. And taking this opportunity, though, to proselytize to them would just be taking advantage, again, of their generosity and trust when they agreed to speak with me. So that was definitely off the table. And the last one was don't get involved. You'll see later in my pre-interview disclaimer that I had to make it clear to them that I was going to purposely sound a bit detached and cold when pursuing my answers. That's just because it was so hard when you're talking to people who have grown up your friends, or family members, and not slide into a more conversational vibe where I also start maybe sharing an anecdote or two or some of my own opinions. So even when things get emotional, or when I felt I wanted to empathize a bit, I didn't want my own emotions to cloud the study at all. So these rules in place, I went ahead and I reached out to a few people. There's no directory of any kind for people in this position, so I put together a list of people that I hadn't seen in a while and I figured were out, and I asked a few people to help with other names I might have missed that might fit this criteria. I took a deep breath again, and I started to reach out via text, Facebook, phone, etc. My response right off the bat was absolutely amazing. I contacted about 30 people who fit the criteria with a target in mind of hitting at least 20. I wanted to do at least 20 interviews before I could, I think, have a good enough sample group to share my findings. Heard back from about 25. A few of them just never responded. It's very likely that their phone numbers have changed in the last 15-ish years that I last tried to contact them. 24 agreed to be interviewed. I interviewed 20 of them. The other 4 who agreed to do it never were able to be pinned down for an interview. If you're watching, I know you know who you are, and I still like to talk to you. Only one person said no. I was honestly going into this expecting a 50-50 yes-no ratio, or maybe even more no than yes. So I was overall floored, not only anybody saying yes, but the enthusiasm that I got for it. It was really exciting. So after several months of all kinds of Zoom appointments and phone calls and getting stood up on Zoom and all that stuff, I was able to put together enough data to present my findings to you all now. Before I do that, I should clarify one thing. Every single participant was given the exact same disclaimer that is shown here. The original copy was even more legalistic, so I decided to make it a bit more conversational because the original one made the first couple of people I spoke to a bit uncomfortable. They thought they were being deposed or something. It came off a little bit too detached. So I'm not going to reread the whole thing to you right now, but this PowerPoint is free if anybody would like to read it later. The 2 main points to keep in mind that I was very clear with everybody is that the main use of this study was most likely to be used in a lecture to other Christadelphians, so they're not going to be surprised to hear their words shared here. Also, that their real names can and most likely would be used. They were all given the option to be anonymous, but only 2 of the 20 took that option. Many seemed keen on their real names actually being shared and seemed happy for that to be part of it, but only 2 asked to remain anonymous. So I will honor that this morning if their words are used. So now we get to the actual findings of the actual survey. The survey itself is a 10-question survey. It's been a while since my surveys course in college. After putting together the questions, I thought, I really wish there was somebody who could proofread this stuff for me. If only I had a childhood friend who's now grown up and has written a bunch of books. I thought, oh, Jason Hensley. So I sent a few questions to him, and he gave me some thoughts. So if anybody has any problems, his name is also in the book. No, but mostly he just kind of revised a few of my words. Most of this is all me for good or bad, but we're going to go through each one now and get a few answers and some data, and then we'll get into observations. So we're going right into it now with question number 1. I thought a pretty simple one. Question number one, do you consider yourself a former Christadelphian, meaning somebody who no longer identifies with that religion? I expected 100% yeses because they were told up front what I was planning to do here when I first contacted them, but a few of them considered themselves lapsed Christadelphians, so I had 17 who said yes, firmly former, and 3 who said, they don't currently live near an ecclesia or zoom into one regularly, but if they were in town with family, then they might pop by for a breaking of bread. But they answered the future questions based on them, based on the date they last were regularly attending memorial service. So they do still consider themselves former for the purposes of the study, but they wouldn't classify themselves that way. Question 2. If you no longer identify as Christadelphian, how many years have you been out of that religion? If you still identify as Christadelphian, how many years has it been since you regularly attended memorial service? So the lowest was 3 years, which is Mike Jennings. Longest was Jessica Bartell-Wren, which was 16 to 18 years, whether you count her stopping attendance or formally withdrawing. The average is about 9.25 years. For those of you who like the math. But a lot of these answers were from interviews that were conducted as far back as 2021, so these numbers would be a little higher now. Along with question 1, this is mostly just part of the data collection process and keeping them comfortable, starting off easy with 2 easy questions. Also hard to fill 10 questions, I found out. So, but don't worry, question 3 is, I think, the big one. I'm not going to read the full question as we're going through it piece by piece, but the main portion is, what would you identify as the main reason if you were leaving the Christadelphian community? Please select any of these options from my anecdotal experience, and I listed a few options there. If I just asked them, hey, why did you leave, and just wait for them to start talking, it'd be very hard to quantify those findings or to really, put that down anywhere. So I gave them these options that I thought everybody would fit into. Thankfully, everybody did fit into A through E for the most part. F was a catch-all. If none of these apply, please provide F. A few people said F, but nobody gave that option only. So I felt pretty good that the ideas I had in my head, most of them did identify one of those ideas as the actual reason. So I thought it'd be best to go through each of the answers individually and go through the responses that I got. It wouldn't be a PowerPoint without a pie chart, so I put this one together. I was pretty proud of it. And this is how many people picked each of the options, and I split it up there. Keep in mind that they could pick multiple options for each person. So we've got some people that picked up to 4 categories and some people that just picked 1. So there's a lot of information here, so I'm going to go through each of the 5 categories, and then we'll go through F later. So A, no longer identify with Christadelphian beliefs. This ended up being the biggest one with 11 people choosing that option. It was probably the most popular because that's the one that people would mostly pick if they no longer identified in any religion at all. So all the atheists that I spoke to would pick that option because they don't identify with Christadelphian beliefs or indeed any beliefs of any religions. Oops. B, marry somebody who's not Christadelphian. This one was really interesting to me because as an outsider looking in, or I guess an outsider, insider looking out in this case, I was could have sworn this was the number 1 reason people left the community. You always hear about that being a big thing growing up. Only 3 people picked that option. With only 3 people noting this as their reason, there were 10 people involved in this study who got married to somebody outside of Christadelphia shortly before or shortly after leaving. So only 30% of the eligible people answering that question picked that option. This told me something I think was very interesting, which is many of them did not attribute any fault to their spouse for their leaving. This shows me that there are a lot of other decisions and thought processes that go into making this choice. And for many of these people, that decision was made way before they decided to marry outside of Christadelphia. If you allow me a tiny bit of an early subjective observation here, I think that we as Christadelphians tend to demonize the concept of dating or marrying outside the truth, quote unquote, as if that act alone is strong enough to sway somebody out of their faith. Of course, we've had many members over the years whose spouse does not attend, and they still come every week. The odds of somebody being 100% enthusiastic and gung-ho, having no doubts at all, and then suddenly meeting somebody and saying, oh, never mind all this, and that's probably not happening as much as we think. As far as people I was close to, I remember when Matt and Krista Jones both started dating somebody outside Christadelphia, and I was so concerned about it, but neither of them noted that as a reason for their leaving. So this to me is a prime example right off the bat of thinking that we know everything when we're looking at the situation from outside and how much we can learn from just talking to them. And then C was a major issue with a certain member of the community that soured, quote unquote, their relationship with everybody else. We had 5 people say they had bad experiences with certain people in the community. I made the decision not to name any names that were told to me from anybody in the study. If any of you are concerned, then don't worry. But also, if you are concerned, maybe wonder why you should be concerned. Jerusha Foltz said her husband would receive scathing letters after his exhortations, which certainly didn't encourage a feeling of a loving community or enthusiasm for future exhortations or service. Josh Barrett said that, quote, "The idea that the world is ending and there's a pending judgment and the signs of the time rhetoric is tantamount to child abuse, psychologically speaking, to put that on kids," end quote. He noted a few members that were very doom and gloom, being quite unhelpful. One of the anonymous respondents said that they experienced what they described as spiritual abuse from a young age, with people in the community and in their family withholding their approval or love unless they went to Sunday school, CYC, got baptized, etc. So all these interactions with certain members of the community seemed to really stick with these people, some of them many, many years later. And then D was that they felt frustrated with the community in general. This had 8 people respond. This one was really included in the study in case there wasn't a single person that frustrated them, but rather the community at large. Brad Phillips was the only one who gave this as his sole reason for leaving. He expressed a general feeling that he hadn't really found a community where he felt that he fit. He said, quote, "There's nothing that religion would give me that I can't get elsewhere in my life." He became so frustrated and impatient with the shortcomings that he was feeling in the community, and he felt out of place because he had a hard time figuring out what he wanted. Josh also mentioned this in a joking manner. He said, I felt like I was in a bowling league and I was no longer into bowling. This seemed like a common issue for a few people, a general feeling that they just didn't belong anymore. I put E in here for people who might have been basically all the way there but just had one thing that they couldn't get past. That was if you had a major issue regarding a specific belief or tenet with the Christadelphian belief system. Nobody gave this as their sole answer, but 10 people did give this as a contributing reason. I think my own biased, self was thinking a bunch of people would say, "Oh yeah, I only have one problem with the Christadelphians, so if we fix that, then I'm back," kind of thing. But that never happened. Everybody had multiple other reasons for leaving, and that wasn't the only one. F, we only have 3 people who chose F, which is essentially saying that they had a reason that they did not feel was covered by any of the other options. I thought it was pretty comprehensive, so I was surprised anybody was choosing F. We'll talk more about these people later, because that's a very interesting answer to me. So anybody who didn't feel like they fit all of those options, I think, was really worth looking into. We will get into that later. So that was a big one that took the most time in my interviews. We'll move now, though, to question 4. Did you make an effort to notify other members of the Christadelphian community that you were close to, that you're thinking of leaving or having major doubts, issues, or misgivings regarding the religion? I wanted to ask this one because I wanted to have an idea if the respondents were mostly just subtly and slowly stopping attending and sneaking away, or if they were trying to be vocal about their issues in a way that they might be looking for help or encouragement. What I found was a 50-50 split exactly. So 10 people said yes, 10 said no. This really seems to be down to personality type as a bit of an objective observation. 10 people who said yes were people that you might think in your head were, oh, they seem to be more comfortable discussing things with people. 10 who said no were people who might be a bit more introverted and not want to share that kind of talk with most people. I mainly asked this question, though, to lead into the 5th question. Do you feel that a concerted effort was made by those close to you to convince you to change your mind or to maintain your membership with the Christadelphians? So this question was asked to see if they had a memory of us as a community reaching out. I know that most AB members usually reach out to lapsed members and ask them for their status with the Ecclesia, and a few people that I talked to seem to vaguely recall getting an email or two from an AB member. They wouldn't necessarily consider that as a, quote, concerted effort by those close to you, so they might not have answered yes if they indeed were reached out by an AB member. But getting an email from an older brother from the AB that haven't spoken to ever, saying you're about to be disfellowship, they wouldn't necessarily, consider that as a genuine and earnest attempt to, maintain their membership. But still, pretty similar results to the last one, pretty even split. A few of them said that I was the first person to ever talk to them about this kind of stuff ever. However, was pretty even split there, saying that some felt like there was a good effort and some felt like there was not. And question 6 was, if you do not feel like a concerted effort was made to maintain your membership, do you believe that a larger effort should have or could have been made that could have possibly changed your decision? If you do believe an effort was made, do you believe that they tried too much and possibly pushed too hard? This one was a lot more one-sided. This is where the even splits ended. 19 of the 20 believed a large effort should not have been made. And only one person said that, yes, it's possible that at the right moment when they were having doubt that somebody could have talked to them and possibly changed their mind. All the others either said that it was too late because their minds were already made up, or they were glad that people didn't push because it would have made it harder or more awkward to make that decision, or would have gotten confrontational. They didn't want that either. So question 7, are you currently a participating member in a different religion or Christian denomination? If so, would you classify your involvement in this religion to be less or more than the amount you were involved in the Christadelphian community? This was included here because I was interested to know if it was a problem they had with religion in general or just our religion. I know that speaking again as a salesperson is a different feeling if somebody leaves you because they just don't believe in insurance anymore, don't feel like that they need it anymore, versus somebody who leaves you and is now with a different agency. They both upset you in different ways as a salesperson, but you can learn different things from both situations. If somebody left me because they just don't believe in insurance anymore, then the goal is convincing them that they need insurance in their life and that it should be important to them. If they leave for a different agency, then the goal is now to convince them why you're the best agency to stick with. This, of course, correlates with the Christadelphian situation. The second part of the question is if they are more or less involved. The reason I was asking this is because I do feel like the expectation of involvement for a typical Christadelphian is probably a bit higher than most of mainstream Christianity. Lots of people, only go to church a couple times a year. So I was wondering if maybe people were leaving because they wanted to go to a church where they weren't expected to go to every single Sunday school and memorial service and midweek class and CYC and all that stuff every week. So I thought maybe that might be a contributing factor. 15 of the 20 are not involved in any religion at all, while 5 of them are in different states of religion/spirituality. 3 of them seem to be regularly attending an actual religious service, while 2 identify as spiritual, quote unquote, without being part of any organized religion. Of those 5, only 1 identified as being more involved than they were before, while the rest were all somewhere between being as involved or less involved. So this is also just more of a data collection question, just to kind of see if we can learn anything from that, and also led me nicely into the next question. Question 8, if you are not a current member of another religion or denomination, why not? If so, what does this religion do differently or better than the Christadelphians that convinced you that it would be a better fit for you? We'll go more in depth later as we talk about certain specific aspects of the Christadelphian belief system that people had frustrations with. But for this, we'll provide some macro observations I had from their responses. Most of the respondents no longer believe in God or organized religion at all, so the idea of going to a church just wouldn't make sense. And some might still have the same beliefs, but they have been learning their whole life from Christadelphia how wrong the other churches are, so why would they feel the need to worship there? Those have all been tainted. A lot of their other responses have to do with our stance on socio-political issues such as gay marriage, voting, etc., as well as women's roles and other things like that. And they said that the other religions would handle those issues in ways that made them feel more comfortable or included. We're going to address those actual issues a bit more in depth coming up here with the next question and future slides. The next question is another kind of big one here, so we'll go into question 9. Are there any specific parts of the Christadelphian community that we haven't discussed yet that particularly frustrate you or you think should be changed? Conversely, are there any specific parts of the Christadelphian community that you miss that you think they did particularly well? I want this to be a catch-all question towards the end of the survey so I could hopefully get all of the miscellaneous concerns or comments that they might have wanted to say before but they didn't feel like they had an opening. So I want to start first with a pretty big question, asking if there's any specific parts of the Christadelphian community that frustrate you or you think should be changed. So I asked that question to everybody and got this response from Vaughn, and he was very clear. He was joking, but he asked me this, and I said, "I have all night. Go right on ahead." But he did have something that was a bit more helpful. An overall feeling that it felt like the people making decisions for Christadelphian communities had a hard time empathizing or trying to understand what people might be going through, instead of just reiterating rote beliefs. This was a common belief among the respondents. I got another interesting quote from Matt Jones. The amended/unamended debate was really harmful to my faith and my process. The entire debate is a question of the divine prerogative. It's a huge waste of spiritual capital. Why are we arguing about this when there are people suffering? Which sounds like Matt Jones talking, right? A couple other people mentioned this issue to me as well. There's an overall feeling of a major contradiction within the Christadelphian belief system. How do we have, quote, the truth, the only correct interpretation of the Bible and its teachings. And we're so sure that all the other religions are 100% wrong, but we can't seem to agree on those supposedly infallible teachings within our own very small community. It's hard to argue that we have the truth when we can't seem to agree what the truth is. Another good quote I got was from Jerusha. Jerusha Folt said, "It became more important to be right than to be loving." This was a quote that I found so powerful that I mentioned it to a few other respondents, and they said that they felt the same way, that it really kind of struck a chord with them as well. Just to clarify, this quote is not to argue that it's not important to be right at all, but more so that she felt Christadelphians were approaching every issue and argument feeling that they needed to bash you over the head up front with how right they are and also how wrong you are. They just have to think about how to approach out of love first. We'll get to some other frustrations that people had a bit later, but to pick you guys back up a bit, we're going to transition now to a few of the strengths that I was told about. Community. This word was used by the majority of our respondents totally without prompting or anything, and those who didn't use that word also really appreciated their friendships made in this community, or they used the word family or, quote, global family. There's clearly something done well by the Christadelphians to foster a feeling of belonging and community wherever we are in the world, which is appreciated by most of the respondents that I spoke to. Many especially pointed out the worldwide reach of the community, saying they could go to different countries or continents where there are other members of the community and feel comfortable staying in their home with them. And music was also mentioned by a few people as another strong suit. Mostly the good singers, as you'll see, but it still seemed to be an important part of their spiritual journey. That was something that was interesting to me as a guy who likes singing, is okay with it, but probably not as super into it as other Christadelphians are. No offense to anybody who participates in it, but sometimes the cantata or the choir at Idlewild can go a bit long for my taste. But it's important to remember how crucial that can be for some people. Another strength with our small community, kind of combining both the last slide and this one, is that people really liked that, in a small group like ours, you can sing in a place of real prominence. Lots of big churches will have professional singers or bands performing, and if you're really into singing, there's no way you can really get up on that stage unless you're really, really good. So the small size of our community lends itself to passionate singers being able to, sing in a place of prominence if they want to. And that took us to our last question. Looking back at how you left the Christadelphian community, is there anything you wish you had done differently, or that the community had done differently? Do you have any regrets about your experience, or do you feel it was/is the right decision for you? I kind of wanted to have a question at the end that wrapped it up a little bit and put a bow at the end, but this is a bit of a mess. The first part is asking for a descriptive answer. Is there anything you wish you had done differently? Then ask a redundant question with what the community had done differently, and then that's a binary question. Is this the right decision for you? But I was glad I made it to 10 questions, and a huge thank you again to my great respondents. Made me look good. They had a bunch of great responses to these questions. There are a few people who said that they wish they had left sooner, ripped that Band-Aid off sooner to avoid the drama that did happen when they finally made that choice. And a few gave an answer that I thought was actually pretty interesting. Some say they left quietly out of respect for the community. They felt like they had too much respect and love for those still in the ecclesia. They didn't want to make a big scene or debate a bunch of people and possibly have other people question their own faith. They decided to bow out to avoid that from happening. I never personally thought of it that way, so I thought that was an interesting take on it. As to that binary question at the end there, I was, unfortunately, the only unanimous decision of the study. All respondents do not regret leaving. It might seem obvious because if they had regrets by now, they probably would have already come back. But again, the small biased part of me was kind of saying, after this conversation, their eyes would be open and they would say, "Oh, I'm coming back." However, 100% of the answers on this one were the same. All said that they think the decision to leave was the best for them. So now that's the end of the questions. We're going to get into my personal takeaways and a few subjective observations on a couple of the major topics that we brought up most frequently. I'd like to reiterate that these are a mixture of my opinions and those brought up by my respondents, and I'll try to make it clear when I'm giving one or the other. I also like to point out that I'm not calling for any immediate changes on all of these topics, but rather trying to bring them to all of your attention to make sure you know that these are real problems that many of your former brothers and sisters had, so I think it's worth listening and letting down your defenses a bit to try to learn something. However, I certainly don't want to be too presumptuous or anything or have any delusions of grandeur. I'm not going to fix everything wrong with Christadelphia in a couple of slides. Okay. I'm just kidding. Sorry. I need a bit of a palate cleanser before I get into part 3 because this is going to be the tough part. Okay, so we're going to move into part 3 now. I kept hearing the same several subjects brought up by over and over again by all of my respondents, so I thought it might make the most sense to kind of lump those responses together into their own sections. So again, I'll take a deep breath and we'll jump right in. The number one issue by far that was a concern from our respondents was regarding women's roles in the ecclesia. And remember in my requirements back then, I did not ever say anything about gender. I didn't care if anybody reached out, it was a woman or man or whatever. I did not seek out even split or anything like that. So when I looked back at the end of my 20, when I had my 20 interviews ready to go, I had noticed 15 of the 20 respondents were women. I do not think this is a coincidence. 4 of the other people that agreed to the survey that didn't get back to me were also women. So of the 15 women that I spoke to, they all had a few concerns that they would repeat to me. And to name a few, they were: women have a reduced role and smaller amount of input in the ecclesia. They aren't allowed to speak, read, pray, teach children over a certain age, serve on arranging boards, etc., which left many of them feeling a lack of agency in their own community. Sarah Jones had an interesting perspective on this topic. She said, quote, "Women were not included in the speaking schedule or other engagements. This is such a shame because there's a lot of potential and perspective that women bring. There's also a brother who was baptized. You could tell that they did not enjoy speaking, and they were encouraged and pushed into learning how to do public speaking better. It would have been better to have a female who's just as smart and intelligent and can put together a talk and is more inspirational," end quote. This is obviously a massive topic and nothing that's going to be changed this morning or this week, but going forward to be a major factor to retaining more female members if there are more options for them to serve here. I know some here would agree that a few of the restrictions seem a bit arbitrary. They can teach in Sunday school, but they can't teach teenagers. Or when I was growing up young, I'm unbaptized. Excuse me, I got some water. When I was growing up, young unbaptized men were allowed to read the Bible from the podium for Sunday school, but you couldn't do it if you were a young unbaptized woman. And I understand there's some support behind, not being able to exhort and all that kind of stuff, but there's little support about, and they can't teach midweek classes or special lectures. There were several other people who I spoke to who really wanted the opportunity to do more, and the idea of telling somebody they aren't allowed to serve their ecclesia more is tough for them to hear, and it's a tough rebuke to give. The next one I heard several times was that specifically single women have even less of a role. Many single women that I spoke to, or women who were at least single when they left, said that the overall feeling coming out of CYC age was, okay, now you've got to find yourself a good Christadelphian man to marry, then you have kids, and you raise them in the Sunday school, and that's your role. For those women who were unable to find a Christadelphian man, they felt like they had even less to do for their community. It seemed like something that could be possibly addressed by looking at option 1, or looking at the first issue. But again, there's a good chunk of people who are willing to serve more and want to do more and are not able to. That would frustrate lots of people quite a bit. And then number 3, the Bible has so few good female role models. A few people gave me this concern. There's obviously not much we can really do to add more, female members, female characters to the Bible, but maybe we can just try to accentuate the strong biblical women a bit more that are present. There are a lot of great female characters in the Bible, but I felt like they weren't being highlighted quite as much as the male counterparts. And overall, I would say to members of our ecclesia and any other ecclesias listening, I recommend that we strongly re-examine the rules and restrictions regarding women's roles in this ecclesia from a biblical standpoint. Unlike the other aspects that I will bring up here soon that statistically directly affected a minority of the respondents, this issue directly affects 50% of our members. We have a lot of women in our community that can offer valuable input and is a potentially huge untapped resource that we are ignoring right now. If you're a female member of this ecclesia or any ecclesia that does not feel like participating in this way, then that's totally fine. But remember how I feel about singing? It might not be a huge deal for me personally, but I'd be foolish not to realize how big of an issue it is for many others and how it might strengthen their position in our community. The next slide is kind of an offshoot of the last one. The only people who mentioned sexual harassment in the ecclesia were women. I'd like to jump ahead of this one really quick and tell you that I'm not going to use the names of anybody this morning who said that they had to deal with this. Although to be clear, they did not ask me to do that. They seem totally comfortable with their name being used. I'm also not going to share the names of anybody that they accuse to me. Obviously, don't want to deal with any of that either. But hopefully, that's not going to be an issue for anybody. But multiple women said that they had issues with sexual harassment, both of which occurred in CYC settings. So 2 people total came to me of the 15 women that I spoke to. Did not go into too many details. I did not ask for them. But one of them was with a peer in their CYC group, and one was with a supervisor type role that was really just an older teen, young 20th person in a position of power or authority over them. This is obviously not a Christadelphian specific issue. Wherever a group of people are gathered together, there's going to be things like this that are going to happen. However, remember that great community from a couple of slides ago? This becomes a major weakness when combined with this problem. If you have an issue with this kind of thing and you're going to a mega church, you can just stop going and start attending the mega church down the street where nobody will care that you left the old church. Nobody asks questions when you show up at the new church. It's a clean slate. That's not the case in our community. It is noticed if you stop coming to your old ecclesia or if you start going to a different one. One person that I spoke to said they had to stop attending CYC events and some memorial services, and then they'll be criticized by their parents and members of their ecclesia saying that they had to go. This was a young teenage woman being forced to face their predator multiple times a week. If they stopped going, then they would be the bad guy. Brother Eric Sternod spoke to our ecclesia last year about Ecclesia Safe. Ecclesia Safe is a new program to hopefully reduce incidents like this and make the ecclesia a safer place for everybody. When Brother Eric introduced this to our Sunday school, it was received by some about as well as this talk will be received by some, with one of the other issues being overall disbelief that these kinds of things are actually happening in our community. Well, I can tell you now that I've talked to some people, and those are just the ones that felt comfortable enough to share their stories with me, and it is definitely an issue. We have started to implement Ecclesia Safe at our own ecclesia, and I put the website here in hopes other ecclesias will do the same. It's important for this place to feel like a safe and welcoming place to all, and that can transition us nicely into our next topic this morning. This is probably the second most common issue that I heard from people. About half of the respondents mentioned the Christadelphian position on homosexuality as an issue that they had, so with some even noting it as item E from back in question 3 as the one major belief or tenet that they had a disagreement with the Christadelphians. I mentioned other issues on this slide as well. A few other people mentioned things like being involved in politics, such as voting, or involvement in social issues or social movements like Black Lives Matter, serving as a police officer, working in government. All those things were issues for a couple people, but mostly it is the LGBTQ issue. I'd like to reiterate that I do not think that I'm going to change anyone's mind on this topic, nor is that my intention, nor do I think I'm even that persuasive, even if that were my intention. What I did want to share with you on all these topics, which is a few points that I heard from people in this study, some that I had myself, and this is one that I heard a few times that I do agree with. Understanding does not equal acceptance. I think it's not just a thing in Christadelphia, but I think it's a thing in human nature. If there's a topic or any kind of subject that one might strongly believe in, you don't even want to hear anything against it, or you'll feel like you're losing that battle. You might say, if I even hear about gay people anymore, or if I even listen to that thing about transgender people for one more second, or if I even learn what these letters stand for, that somehow just by trying to understand somebody else's point of view, that you are ceding that point, or somehow accepting it implicitly and saying that it's right. I think we need to strongly examine the immediate response we all have to anybody presenting a perspective, belief, or point of view that we are not comfortable with. We are a tiny community that is proportionally shrinking by the year in this country, so if anybody should understand the importance of trying to get other people to appreciate our point of view and to change their perspective, it should be us. Remember that it's more important to approach a disagreement as loving than to be right. I'm paraphrasing, Drusha here, but if we're supposed to be living our lives based on somebody who ate with tax collectors and sinners, remember that this might mean you'll have to listen to an opinion that you don't agree with from time to time. That's no reason not to be loving. This would be especially true if you see a brother or sister who is either struggling with these issues themselves or with close friends or family members dealing with it that is making their walk more difficult for them. Don't approach them saying right off the bat how right you are and how wrong they are, but approach the topic as you should with all topics, with love. We need to understand this is not going anywhere. Children and young people nowadays are more socially conscious than ever before. They're more aware of the rights and wrongs in the world that they see around them, and they want to help or be involved in any way that they can. This isn't going to change anytime soon. I never understood this as an inherently bad thing. I would hope my kids would be raised in a world where people are accepted and loved for who they are. I see that as a hugely preferable to the alternative. Obviously, there's some instruction and guidance that needs to be done as Christadelphian parents, but if we as a community decide to not do anything about this issue or double down on exclusion, then we're going to lose even more people. We need to try to approach this topic and all topics, again, from a place of love. If we try to approach from a place of hate or exclusion, they're only going to come across as the bad guy. Almost all the people that I spoke to left or made their choice to leave in their teens or early 20s. So this time in young people's lives, when they're developing these opinions, is very important. That brings us to another common topic that I heard a few times from my respondents. I hope that some people watching this later on are teenagers. If you're a parent with teenage children, then I recommend you let them listen to this, because this was one of the most saddening things that I heard several times, because it just seems so preventable and like such an easy fix for me. Many feel like they wish they had a better forum to ask questions without fear of rebuke or anger. This is another one of Josh's quotes. He said, "A more welcoming environment where I would have felt comfortable discussing my issues in that forum would have been helpful, and by the time I had enough doubts, it was too late." And he was having regular struggles with the more theological and faith-based problems, but the next quote that I got from Kathy Gonzalez was also interesting in that she wanted just a place to talk about other issues that she might be having. She said, "I really strongly believe a change that would make a great difference would be the ability to talk openly about struggles with sex or very taboo topics that need to be talked about. Sex before marriage, abortions, criticism, and gossip within the church." So this is also similar thing I would hear from other female respondents as well. So I'm talking now directly to young people who might be listening, or teenagers watching or listening. I know that having a conversation with your parents about your faith or your doubts sounds incredibly difficult and awkward, but you know what? They would much rather you talk to them about it now than talk to them later when it's already too late. Most of the people that I spoke to let these doubts and feelings fester for so long, but by the time they were talking about them, they'd already made up their own mind. I can tell you this as a parent myself, as upset as they might get when you first bring up any of your doubts, I hope they don't get upset, just know that they love you and they do want what's best for you, whether it's spiritual or otherwise. I also strongly recommend any CYC leaders to try to find a way to facilitate questions and help like this for their own members, because not all CYC members have a strong parental foundation. I've been to CYC events personally where we were encouraged to submit anonymous questions to be answered, or we split up into boys and girls groups for more in-depth talks. These things can be awkward, but this talk can honestly make the difference between somebody staying or leaving, probably more so than anything else I've discussed so far this morning. Okay, so another deep breath here. I know that a lot of you are coming at this, a lot of you, getting all this stuff in quick succession. I do apologize if any of that was hard to hear. I know it's hard to listen to people talk about this way about your own religion, this major part of who you are, and not feel like it's a personal attack. Believe me, I've talked to people, 20 of these people in the span of a few months. I don't think anyone's mainline anti-Christadelphian as much as I have, and it can be tough to hear. And it's hard not to take it personally when somebody leaves. It's hard not to get angry at them or to feel sad. It makes you feel powerless, frustrated, and upset. Sometimes it might feel like there's nothing you can do, and sometimes that just might be true. It might not be up to you to try to be their savior. That might not be in God's plan. You can pray about it. If they're going to leave, then you can try to reach out and try to be a friend. A near universal refrain I heard from people was that when they were leaving, they started to feel like their friendships turned to be very shallow. People who they thought were really close friends or family members were losing something they had in common and were totally abandoning them. You might be tempted to reach out and feel like you need to preach to them, that you might feel like you need to approach them as a Christadelphian brother or sister first, and that you need to pitch them all the reasons they have to stay. But nobody I spoke to wanted that. They just wanted a friend. You never know what anyone's going through. Remember all those people way back in question 3, they answered F and said there was another issue? I didn't forget about them. This is probably my biggest regret of the whole study, was that I was so laser focused on trying to figure out what we did wrong, what we could do better. I never thought to ask if there were any outside factors to that choice. Sarah Jones said the main reason she stopped coming in the first place is because her and Ben, her husband, would fight every Sunday morning, getting the kids in the car, fighting about being late, forgot to brush their hair. Sometimes it's marital problems they're having that have nothing to do with our religion. Also, I got to my whole wonderful talk with Sophie Eustace, who I hadn't seen since my wedding day, and right when I was hanging up, she kind of raised her hand and said, by the way, my dad died when I was a teenager. I never really got over that hit to my faith. And I thought, oh my gosh, of course, that kind of loss at that formative age would do a number on any of our faiths. I mean, I think it's easy to take topics like these personally, like it's a disagreement with us as a personal affront, when in reality they could be going through something totally different that we have no idea about. A common saying that you hear when somebody commits suicide or when somebody has an extreme mental health breakdown is check on your friends. It's a simple statement with the message that we all have no idea how strong somebody really is or what they're really feeling on the inside. So we're encouraged to check on our friends, even the ones who seem really strong, like they have it all together. I think when we see a brother or sister struggling with their faith or with any of the topics we've covered here, we think it's the biblical, proper thing to do to approach them as their brother or sister in an official Christadelphian capacity. That might not be what they need. I'd like to wrap up with my own conclusion, what I learned from this personally. People kept asking me when I was doing this study what my biggest takeaway was, or what I was most surprised by. Overall, I was surprised and impressed with how loving and supportive everybody was to this study. Like I said, I was expecting about half of them to even say no in the first place. So for almost all of them to not only say yes, but then approach the interview with grace and love and with wonderfully well thought out answers. The response is better than I could have ever imagined. For those who did not reply, I was afraid I would get a bunch of people just, for those who did get back to me, rather, I thought people would be, scorching the earth, saying all these terrible things and really, letting us have it. I got a couple of those, but for the most part, the vast majority were so loving and helpful that I was constantly surprised and impressed by that. And a big thank you again goes out to all of my respondents who did participate in this study. Basically, all the names that you read or heard this morning are from people who are willing and happy to talk about their experiences. If any of you had any question about anything that they said or really just want to catch up and see how they're doing, there's really no excuse not to. I text Josh Barrett every once in a while in my own personal life, and I was just texting him a couple weeks ago just to clarify one of his quotes for this talk. And he said he'd be willing and happy to talk to anybody about these theological questions or clarifications that they might have. I thought I would get a lot of cold shoulders and had quite the opposite. I spoke to a few people who I hadn't seen since my wedding day or shortly thereafter. I spoke to Matt Jones, who I'd forgotten moved to Austin, Texas. And then a few weeks later, I spoke to Brad Phillips, and I said, hey, where are you? He said, I'm in Austin, Texas. And I said, did you know Matt Jones is there? And he was so surprised. So it was so fun just on a personal level just to catch up with all these people and have this great reason to do so. And then the last thing I want to say is keep them in your prayers. Kind of a common question that I got from people when I would talk to them was, why are you doing this? Not necessarily why the study itself being done, because they all agreed that they thought that was a good idea, but specifically, why me? I told them all the same thing, which was the truth, which is that I have my own personal feelings that the Christadelphian community could be doing a few things differently to make some changes, to be more inclusive, and maybe they'll feel a bit more comfortable. But I thought having a class where I just tell everybody this without anybody else's input wouldn't be very helpful. So I thought it'd be an interesting perspective to get to hear from them. At the end of my conversation with Kathy Gonzalez, I just finished telling her this, and she paused for a while, and then she said in a very friendly tone, okay, well, I'm praying for you and whatever you're going through. And I was a bit taken aback, don't worry about me, I don't need your prayers. But I thanked her and appreciated that she was thinking of me, and I just thought I was going through something difficult with my faith. I don't think I was or am, struggling with my faith, but I did come away from the study with an overall feeling of frustration. I spent most of my hours of every day, like I said, being a salesman, and approaching it from that aspect made me the most irritated. We have the best product in the world that we are trying to sell. We have a great community, strong, well-researched beliefs and doctrines, and we believe in an everlasting life in an eternal kingdom. Those things should be easy to sell. It's like if you give me an insurance policy that was free and covered everybody with no exceptions. However, to stretch the insurance metaphor, people are having trouble with all of the exclusions. We're having trouble with selling a product, a belief system that we feel so strongly about, to the point that we seem to be losing people faster than we're adding them. We've known our whole life that the Bible is perfect. Christ, as our example, is perfect, but we are not. So obviously, something is wrong with the way that we as humans are presenting this belief system. We are the weak link. That's not an attack against the beliefs, but against the believers, who are obviously fallible human beings who know that we are in constant need of change and improvement. It's not a problem with the product, but a problem with the marketing. And you can trust me, I had a minor in marketing. What we need to do is remember to keep those people in our prayers, but also to pray for ourselves. Pray that we can practice a religion where everybody feels welcome, where people feel comfortable and emotionally close enough to us to share not only their beliefs, but also their doubts. We need to pray not only for strength of those who have left to find their way back, but strength for us to be accepting of those who change their mind or who might disagree with us. We need to pray not only for others to change, but also for ourselves. Thank you. I will close in prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, we come before you this morning, hearing some difficult things that I know some of us might feel strongly about, and that's fine. I think that the passion that we have is great and should be encouraged. We just need to learn, Lord, where to focus these passions sometimes, and which things we should be really focusing our anger or frustration on. We pray that you'll give us the strength to learn which parts of us and what responses we have are wrong and which ones need to be changed. We pray that you'll give us the guidance as we look more deeply into your word for ways to incorporate others into our community in a more involved way. We pray that you will help us in this difficult transition period, and that you will watch over us in all that we do. And in Jesus' name, amen.